And welcome to the Migration, People of Colour and the Nationality and Borders Bill webinar. Tonight is hosted by the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum in partnership with JPIT, the Evangelical Alliance and Churches Together in England. And it's absolutely amazing to have you all with us this evening. Now, my name is Shamara Fletcher, and I'm the Principal Officer for Pentecostal, Charismatic and Multicultural Relations at Churches Together in England. And I'm also a proud member of the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum. And I'll be your chair this evening, and I look forward to journeying with you as we explore this important issue of the Nationalities and Borders Bill. Now, before we go into our program for this evening, I'm just going to give you some context of what the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum is. It's an ecumenical Christian entity that seeks to speak prophetically on behalf of Black and Brown Christians in the UK to the government on racial justice issues, specifically around reparations. And tonight they have arranged a special and diverse range of panelists who will each share with you the impact of the Nationality and Borders Bill, what it means for our churches across the UK, and also to discuss its diverse impact on those seeking asylum and citizenship, especially for people of colour living in the UK. There will also be an opportunity after we hear from our amazing panelists for you to ask your questions, those burning questions that you have, and our panels of experts will be able to answer that for you. So who is on our panel this evening? I'll begin with Patrick Vernon, OBE, who has been spotlighted now. Patrick is an independent, non-executive director of Birmingham and Solihull ICS, where he leads on inequalities. He's also a former non-executive director for Hertfordshire NHS Trust, an associate director for Connected Communities for the Centre of Ageing Better, and he is also the chair of Citizens Partnership for HSIB. Now, Patrick is also a Winston Churchill Fellow. He's the Fellow of Goodenough College, the Fellow of Imperial War Museum, and a Fellow of the Royal History Society. And he's also the former Associate Fellow for the Department of History of Medicine at Warwick University. Patrick was also awarded an OBE in 2012 for his groundbreaking work on tackling health inequalities for Black and Brown ethnic minority communities. And in 2018, to recognize this groundbreaking work, he received an honorary PhD from Wolverhampton University and was selected as one of the most 1,000 progressive Londoners by the Evening Standard. In 2019, he was rewarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for his campaigning and advocacy work by the SMK Foundation. And in 2020, he was selected by British Vogue as one of Britain's top 20 campaigners and was included in the 2020 Power List of 100 influential Black people in Britain. And he is also the co-author of 100 Great Black Britons. In 2020, Patrick also established the Majoni Fund, which provides small grants to families who have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Finally, Patrick is a broadcaster and writes blogs and articles for national and international media on healthcare, cultural heritage, and race. Patrick, it's absolutely amazing to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing from you further in the night. Thank you. Next on our panel this evening, represented the Joint Public Issues team, is Steve Tinnin, who has been the Baptist Union's Public Issues Enabler since November 2021, and as such is the Baptist representative on the Joint Public Issues team. Patrick is also a minister of the church in Southend, Essex, for 9 years before that, and his church hosted refugees and campaigned locally to see more welcomed to the town. Steve is also the chair of Safe Passage National Campaigns Team, which is a group of grassroots activists that have campaigned for immigration policies for the last 6 years, especially concerning the rights of child refugees. Thank you, Steve, for all the work you do, and it's great to have you on our panel this evening. We also have Alicia Edmond representing the Evangelical Alliance. It's great to have you, Alicia. Alicia joined the Evangelical Alliance as Head of Public Policy in August 2021, and she has also led the organization's parliamentary engagement on the Nationality and Borders Bill. She brings over 15 years experience working in politics, policy and activism. And after completing her degree in politics, Alicia went to work with UK charities and overseas ministers specialising in international human rights law, social justice, restorative justice, and the government's serious violence strategy. Alicia, it's great to have you with us this evening. And finally, representing the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum is Wale Hudson Roberts. He is a justice enabler for the Baptist Union and has worked internationally and nationally on justice issues for Black and Brown communities. It's absolutely amazing to have you, Wale.
Thank you, Samara.
Now, just to give you a format of the night, each panelist will be asked a question around a policy clause containing and concerning to the Nationality and Borders Bill. And as I said earlier, you will then have an opportunity to ask your questions. And just in terms of Zoom protocols, we are asking that everybody remains on mute until it comes to the Q&A, and you can then ask your questions. So we're going to move now to our first guest of the night, which is Alicia Edmond from the Evangelical Alliance. And Alicia, the question that we have for you is, can you please provide us with an overview of the Nationality and Borders Bill and also the EA's response? Over to you.
Thanks, Shamara, and good evening, everyone. Very pleased to be with you. So I'm set with the wonderful challenge of under 7 minutes to summarize a 120-page piece of legislation. And it's important to start that the conversations that we're having around the Nationality and Borders Bill is that this bill is yet to be law. There is still conversations, divisions between the Houses of Parliament and the Houses of Lords, and it's imperative that both parts of the House come to an agreed wording of what the bill will be. But I want to begin that the Nationality and Borders Bill is set within a political context, which feels like a distant memory, which is the politicized and polarized debate of the Brexit debate. And so in 2019, if we can remember that long ago, much of the conversations, campaign slogans was around getting Brexit done. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the Conservative Party's manifesto pledge, because it's that which is borne out to lead the policy direction of this government and this bill. And so very much in that manifesto, it made a pledge, one, to get Brexit done, but specifically to set up an immigration system that modelled itself on the Australian style points-based system. Points-based meaning that it was about economics and skills-based in terms of priority of how people would access and live in this country. Fast forward to March of last year, the Home Office and the civil servants within that department set out its new plan for immigration, setting out 3 objectives. One, that it would bring fairness to the system, that it would better protect those seeking asylum. A second objective of the policy was that it would deter illegal entry into the country and particularly focus around people smuggling networks. And third, and most crucially, is the language of giving greater rights to the Home Office and immigration agencies to remove those from the UK more easily and readily. So from March last year through to May, there was a consultation period where civic society and those specializing in refugee resettlement support, faith-based communities could engage, and the Evangelical Alliance submitted a 17-page submission that very much framed our campaigning messages, my conversations in Parliament, and some of our briefings to member organisations and church leaders. The key and central message behind that is that any immigration or asylum system should be founded and grounded in the humanity and dignity of the individual. We also use it as an opportunity to explain why it is the case that those, particularly Christians fleeing persecution, would seek to take more irregular routes to access the UK. From the outset, we were opposed to a differential treatment and very much was in support of greater protections for unaccompanied children. So that policy intent in March last year then became what we now know as the Nationality and Borders Bill, which entered Parliament on the 5th of July 2021. And I just want to read this quote that came from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, as part of her introduction of this bill. And it builds on this theme of migration, and it builds on the government and particularly the Conservative Party's agenda in this. It reads as this: this legislation delivers on what the British people have voted for time and time again, for the UK to take full control of its borders. It paves the way for a fair but firm system that will break the business model of the gangs that facilitate dangerous and illegal journeys to the UK, while speeding up the removal of those with no right to be here. So the Nationality and Borders Bill is split into 5 sections. Part 1 looks at nationality, and I won't speak much to that because Patrick is going to be talking about Clause 9, for where that features. Part 2 is about asylum and the treatment of those seeking asylum in this country. Part 3 is immigration control. Part 4 is age assessment, and Part 5 is modern slavery. So the bill is an incredible breadth that covers nationality, citizenship, refugees, asylum seekers. It's a huge, vast breadth of policy. And the Evangelical Alliance focused primarily in its engagement on Part 2, advocating for greater treatment and services to those seeking refuge and asylum in this country. We were opposed to the creation of the unjust and discriminatory system, which is referenced in Clause 11, whereby the government in law would set a policy for which there could be different treatment based on how mode of entry into the country. We produced 2 policy submissions, one to the Joint Committee on Human Rights and one to the Public Bills Committee, which is found on our website, where we were producing research evidence based from the United Nations, based on convention, based on testimonials of what churches were doing in community in terms of resettlement, to demonstrate the flaws in the immigration and asylum system and how it was disproportionately criminalizing those seeking refuge in this country. I had the joy and task of meeting with different members of Parliament from across the political spectrum, those who were Conservative backbenchers to those who were in the Labour Party and those in Lib Dems, and particularly encouraging them and mobilising them to get behind 2 amendment clauses when the bill was going through its reading in December and that vote. One of our member organisations, Welcome Churches, was a great ally in talking about the operational challenges and the support that it was giving to churches across the country to improve both resettlement and integration for those seeking asylum in this country. And earlier this year, we also worked with Steve and JPIT in signing both their letter and also promoting through our network member organisations and individual churches to support that. So I'm going to pause there just to give an overview that the bill is yet to be law. There is a lot of hustle and bustle within Parliament. Last week on Tuesday, the House of Lords amendments that sought to remove Clause 9, the powers of the Home Secretary to remove citizenship, was revoked. Clauses to encourage right to work were ignored and downplayed. So there's a lot to bargain for and a lot to be discussed still within Parliament. So I'm going to hand back to Shamara. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alicia, from the Evangelical Alliance. Thank you. And just to remind our audience this evening, if you have any pressing questions from what Alicia and any of our other panelists will say, to use our Q&A section, and we as the technical team will pick up on your questions and make sure that they are answered. So again, thank you, Alicia, for that. We're now going to come on to Steve Tinning from JPIT. And Steve, the question that we have for you this evening is, would you mind telling us a little bit more about the Joint Public Issues Team and the specific activity JPIT has committed to highlighting the bill's concerns? Thank you, Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Shamara, and thank you, Alicia, as well, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. It really feels like an incredible privilege to be addressing you and the listeners on this issue. The Joint Public Issues Team is a collaboration of the Baptist Union of Great Britain and the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church, and to some extent the Church of Scotland. And we've had concerns about the government's direction on immigration since the new plan for immigration consultation began. And many of our fears were realised when the Nationality and Borders Bill was published. There is for us much to be dismayed about the proposed legislation, but JPIT's initial concerns focused in 4 areas. This clause 11 that Alicia mentioned earlier, this differential treatment of refugees that depended upon their method of travel. So those who were privileged enough to be able to access a safe route that had been set up by the government would come and receive refugee status and all the privileges that came with it. But those who were not able, for whatever reason, to access that sort of route into the country and forced to travel in desperation by other means would be criminalised. And that for us just went against the Refugee Convention that just gave permission for asylum seekers to enter the countries to seek asylum. This felt like this was criminalising desperate, vulnerable people. The second is the lack of new safe routes and no commitment to numbers. You know, if you're going to introduce legislation that says you can come if you come by a safe route, and then in the same breath not introduce any new safe routes, that felt unjust and inconsistent with the rest of the policy. And so that was important to us to address that. The lack of safe routes for unaccompanied asylum seeking children. You know, these are kids, are vulnerable and on their own, and there is no allowance for their safe routes to come. And the lack of safe routes for family reunion, particularly of children that have family here, still weren't being permitted to come except with parents and except in some extremely minimal exceptional circumstances. So recognising our shared concerns, we collaborated together with Refugees, this umbrella organisation that had brought various charities and organisations together against the bill, and with Safe Passage, a charity that we've worked with before on the rights of refugee children, and both of whom were keen for us to amplify the voices of faith leaders against the bill. And I have a bit of a background in community organising, this process that has been utilised by many a civil rights movement in the past on building power to bring about change. And the government kept saying, this is what the British people had voted for. And we were desperate to demonstrate that huge swathes of the British public, Christians in particular, but actually those from all kinds of faiths, did not vote for this hostile approach to immigration. So we tried to organise ourselves and demonstrate this power, and we wrote a letter. So actually the second time we've done that in recent years. 2 years ago, we wrote a letter to the Prime Minister highlighting the fact that very soon there would be no safe and legal routes for child refugees in Europe to seek sanctuary in the UK, with a policy called the Dubs Amendment coming to an end, and another policy called the Dublin III, which was a European policy coming to an end. That would have allowed family reunification for children, but that was coming to an end because of Brexit, and we were just really conscious that there were no safe routes for kids. So we wrote this letter, 250 faith leaders signed it, including the ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and it got quite a bit of attention in the media, but ultimately it didn't result in a change of policy. And so this year we knew that we had to aim higher, that we had to at least double that target to show an increased resistance to the government's hostile policies. So on the two-tier system, we wrote and said, criminalising and punishing vulnerable asylum seekers who have little choice but to arrive in the UK through irregular routes, when the majority are subsequently able to prove that they have a legitimate basis for their asylum claim, is a disgraceful and dishonourable policy and should be abandoned. And on safe routes, we said the Nationality and Borders Bill provides a wonderful opportunity for the government to stand by its traditional values of family life, community service, and respect for human dignity, values that we share. And firstly, expand family reunion rules to ensure safe passage of those children and vulnerable adults trying to reach family members in the UK. Secondly, open new safe routes for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in Europe. And thirdly, create and implement ambitious new resettlement schemes, always setting compassionate and ambitious targets. And then we concluded the letter by saying, it is a sad fact that in our broken world, forced migration is not a temporary crisis. It is an ongoing reality. And while there is still conflict and injustice in the world, there will always be desperate people needing to seek sanctuary from war, persecution, and suffering. We cannot close our door on them. But this bill does just that. What we need now is political leadership which acknowledges and allays the concerns of the public while promoting the importance of compassion, human life, and dignity. We remain willing to assist in any way we can to this end, and we ask that key representatives on this issue from the government would agree to meet with faith representatives to explore what both we and the government can do to address some of the concerns that we've raised. Very quickly, we doubled our target, and a few weeks ago, I delivered a letter to the Prime Minister signed by over 1,000 faith leaders, including many major Christian denomination leaders, the Evangelical Alliance, as has already been said, and representatives from all the 6 major faith groups of the UK. And we hope that it's a demonstration that the government's hostile approach to immigration is not in the name of people of faith. And actually, it's been affirmed by the tremendous response of the British public to the Ukrainian refugee crisis. It was quoted extensively by the Bishop of Durham in the House of Lords as he brought amendments against the two-tier system. And the bill was amended in a number of ways, addressing a number of the concerns that we've had. But as we've heard Alicia say already, those amendments were overturned by the House of Commons. And we're still looking at how we can now respond back in the House of Lords to bring some of these compromises to us. Clause 9, I should just briefly say before I finish, was introduced by the government to the bill a little bit later on after we'd started this process. This is the clause that concerns the stripping of citizenship with no notice that Patrick will talk about in a moment. I just wanted to say, if it had been there when we'd have started this campaign, it would have been in our letter. It's a disgraceful part of the policy, but it wasn't overlooked by us. It's just we'd already started the process. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Patrick and hearing what he has to say about that and what we can do to respond. Thank you. Shamara.
Thank you so much, Steve, and in particular for highlighting how this bill impacts refugees and children. And I'm sure there'll be questions about that, which will come back to you in our Q&A. Thank you again, Steve. So we're now going to hear from Patrick Vernon, OBE. And the question we have for you, Patrick, is, could you explain why some in the Lords have challenged Clause 9 and the possible similarities between Clause 9 and the Windrush debacle? Thank you. Over to you, Patrick.
Sure, and good evening, everyone that's online this evening, and also for the organisers of this important occasion. As you've already heard from Alicia, the bill is still going through Parliament. There was a lot of lobbying, and I think a lot of people were involved in lobbying the House of Lords. I was involved working with a network and coalition of refugee asylum organisations, campaigners. We had a couple of demos outside Parliament to make the case, and actually it influenced quite a few of the Lords. And the reason why it influenced the Lords, and I'll give you 3 main reasons. First one is that the country, the government has the right to remove anyone from these shores. That right has been there from time immemorial. You know, I am one of the people I featured in my book, 100 Great Black Britons, William Cuffey, who was a Chartist. He got removed, went to Tasmania, and that was around about the 1850s. So there's always been a history of people being removed out of this country. The thing with Clause 9, you would think after the Windrush scandal, and especially when the government commissioned Wendy Williams to do a report called Lessons Learned Review, and just to remind you of the Windrush scandal, that essentially when people came from the Caribbean, also from Africa during the 40s, 50s and 60s, up to early 70s, were deemed to be British under the British Nationality Act 1948. But as we all know, there have been successive changes in immigration policy because of the fear of black and brown people, you know, which reached a pivot point around Brexit. And when the government introduced the immigration bill in 2014, they made a clear stipulation, which is part of the overall strategy called the hostile environment policy, that you need to have documentary evidence that you're British, either passports, biometric cards, a letter, whatever it is from a government to prove that you're British. But actually, this was targeting communities and neighbourhoods around the country. It wasn't targeting at white people. It was targeting the Black and African Caribbean community, Southeast Asian community, people of colour, essentially. And if you can remember those Go Home vans driving around targeted inner areas, I didn't see any of those Go Home vans go down to Somerset. They're all in urban areas. So, and unfortunately, the Windrush generation caught up at the children. So those who came as children on their parents' passports, on their siblings' passports, for many of those, not all of them got passports. It's been estimated that 30% of people in Britain don't have passports. It's actually high in America. The question is, do you need to have a passport to prove that you're British? That's the issue. If you're black and brown, the answer is definitely yes. If you're white, by being white, then you automatically assume that you're British. And that is the heart of the matter of immigration policy for the last 50, 60 years, ever since Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech, that has ingrained politicians across all political parties to develop this two-tier or even a three-tier system, which Clause 9 is actually going to take to the next level. But as a result of campaigning and the work of the media, and I was quite heavily involved in campaigning with many other people, the government was exposed and realised that they treated the Windrush generation wrongly. And you would think they would learn the lessons from that. Wendy Williams made a recommendation in her report that they should review the hostile environment policy, but they haven't. And actually, the hostile environment policy has been further intensified, and Clause 9 is part of that. Clause 9 simply means that anyone can be, if you've got dual nationality, or the potential, I should say, to have dual nationality. This is the key thing, the potential. The government has the right to deport you without notice. But now, Priti Patel, and she's made a number of speeches about this in Parliament, to say that this will be used in exceptional circumstances. And we can have a debate about this, everyone. Exceptional circumstances. So she cites the likes of Shamina Begum, as you know, her citizenship was stripped, despite the fact that she was born here, and she spent all her life here. And even though her parents were Bangladeshi government didn't recognise her, so she's basically stateless. She's apologised for her wrongs, and she wants to come back to Britain. And she's even happy to face the music to come here, but they're rather let her stuck in a refugee camp than to bring her over here. So this is the kind of the pretext of Clause 9 to stop if anyone who gets into terrorist activity, they will be deemed to have their system stripped. And there have been quite a few cases of these. And however, research work done by New Statesman estimates that up to 6 million people will be affected by this. And the vast majority of these will be people who have the potential for dual nationality. Look across the Commonwealth, that will affect every single person, even Canadians or people or have connections will be affected by this, actually, ironically. So if you've got dual nationality, and you've come here from Europe, and all from Africa, from the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the Commonwealth, all those people that came invited to rebuild the NHS, they could be potentially affected. Yeah, I could potentially be affected by Clause 9, because even though I was born in Britain, I have the potential, if I wanted to apply for a Jamaican passport, which means I could be, technically speaking, be deported. And the question is, what is exceptional? And this is a danger, because when you have legislation of this nature, we know through the history of stop and search, even now, recently, the child Q, 15-year-old teenager that was basically strip searched in a school in Hackney. The law and policing has got a track record of targeting and discriminating against people of colour. And that is why there is so much fear against Clause 9, because once that goes in the statute book, it will give the police and the Home Office, without giving any justification, no answer at all, you could be picked up and deported, just like that. It's already happened already under these deportation flights linked with the third generation Windrush people. And this could mean that it could apply to anyone born here, have roots here. Even more so, the government, the Home Office have already disregarded family life on the deportations. And I've been working with Detention Action and working with a whole range of families to try and convince the government to recognise, the impact on family life if a loved one, especially if they're a main wage earner, is deported. But the government seems to have not ignored it completely. So that's why there's no faith. I mean, the government's got track record on this already, by the Windrush scandal, and they've simply not ignored it completely, recognising the scandal, which has not been completely resolved as well. So this is a major concern for all of us, for Christians and all faith, because your parishioners will be affected, you will be affected. The government keep on saying, of course we don't want to deport 6 million people, but then they'll introduce certain criteria. They might say it's exceptional. So, for example, what happens if you do a letter or do a campaign that is seen to be unsavoury or not British enough? They could justify deporting you. And this is the thin edge of the wedge around a totalitarian state. It happened in Germany, it's happened in different parts of the world. And the way that, if you add in other legislation that governments introduced, like the Crime and Policing Bill and other measures, they want to silence people and gaslight us into submission and keep our heads down and reinforce this colonial empire mentality, which is unfortunately part of a wider cultural wars of reminding about the British Empire, how great it was. And we should be very grateful to be in Britain. And how dare you raise any objections around structural racism or reparations? It's a thin edge of a web. If you look at the introduction of hate crime legislation that was introduced in the late 80s, early 90s, which was aimed to target racists and fascists, Black and brown people are more likely to be charged with hate crime than white people. So this is the unintended consequences of legislation in Parliament. And there's a whole range of other examples you can think of. It could be used. The Vacancy Act that was created in 1824 was used by the police in the 1980s for stop and search. So there's clear examples of how state power and abuse of power has been used in a racist way. And that is why that's why the peers in the House of Lords were convinced that this was wrong. They made various amendments to that, which have now been kicked out to the curb. Even Baroness Barzi, at one stage, the chairperson of the Conservative Party, and it's on YouTube, she made a fantastic speech explaining the implications of Clause 9 to her and her family as well. It's had lots of cross-party support. But unfortunately, the government has an 88 majority, and this is part of the jewel in the crown, ironically, of the legislation. And they're going to push this through because they've got the majority in Parliament. What can we do? We still can lobby MPs. The time is slipping against us, but we still can raise our concerns as well. And I think one of the key things which one of the lessons of the Windrush scandal, and what worked around the Windrush scandal in exposing the Windrush scandal. A lot of people got involved raising concerns. I can remember at the height of the Windrush scandal, there were 4 archbishops who wrote a letter in The Guardian complaining about the government treatment. There were a lot of faith organisations that got involved at the time, and this will happen again. And I think it's about arming ourselves right with some of the proper advocacy and law. Make sure that you've got links with immigration lawyers, just in case things might happen when this legislation is passed. And more importantly, I think we have to keep on raising our concerns about the structural racism of this legislation as part of a wider context of structural racism in society. The government recently launched its response to the Tony Sewell report, and even that response, it was very lukewarm. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in the next few months, but more importantly, if this bill is passed, which more likely it will do because of the government's potential advantage in terms of MPs, we need to educate and inform ourselves, your church and parishioners, about their rights. As Bob Marley said, get up, stand for our rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Patrick, and for that timely reminder of Bob Marley's prophetic words to stand up for our rights. Thank you so much. And just for our audience who are watching with us tonight, I'd like to remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A section of our Zoom tonight so that we can ensure our panelists can answer those. Thank you again, Patrick. So we're going to come on to our 4th panelist, Wale Hudson-Robert. And the question we have for you tonight, Wale, is how does the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum think that Black and Brown Christians and white Christians should respond to this bill?
Thank you, Shamara. Thank you for facilitating this conversation. Thank you to Richard Reddy, CTBI, for hosting it. So let me try to explore that very helpful question. I think by practicing 3 things, the prophetic, resistance, and theology. So if I could begin with the prophetic, Martin Luther King would often speak about the importance of a prophetic community. He refused to relegate following Christ to the private spiritual realm or to the arenas of personal piety. Individual conversion was clearly important to Dr. King, but social salvation and individual salvation for King had to occur simultaneously. So for King, the experience of rebirth had to translate into prophetic language, action, and activity. For King, being prophetic meant singing, "We will not be moved." For King, one's capacity to speak truth to power and to do it again and again and again, regardless of the consequences, reflects something of the spiritual and theological potency of a church. Conversely, for King, the absence of campaigning, lobbying, writing, physical protestation, and finding practical ways of challenging injustice is indicative of the church's lack of commitment and engagement with the prophetic. For King, the lack of the prophetic undermines the Church of Jesus and does not bode well for King's commitment and understanding of the beloved community. So how can Black and Brown Christians then be prophetic in the public space? Through resistance. That's the second practice. In his book, Dread and Pentecostal, Professor Robert Beckford highlights a difference between resistance and opposition. He argues that resistance refers to contesting the system from outside, employing tools from out of the system to bring change to the system. Conversely, Opposition engages tools from within the system, employing those tools to subvert the system. In truth, both strategies are obviously inextricably connected. Resistance and opposition need to work simultaneously, together speaking truth to power, together participating in prophetic action. Now, we saw this in action when Black and brown people with faith and no faith, engaged in prophetic action as they protested against the violation of Child Q and the racist system responsible for such heinous and sinful behavior. And we saw it again in action, prophetic resistance, in terms of its application during the Black Lives Matter protests. For Black and brown followers of Jesus, our motivating factor must be God, and that's the third thing. The God of the Exodus, the liberating God. Therefore, if we are to do justice to prophetic resistance, ensuring its longevity during the struggle and the potency of an articulate and powerful voice in the public square, a theology of justice to underpin, sustain, and bring growth to our prophetic resistance is more than merely just important, but I would argue that it is absolutely imperative. Concerning a theology of justice, one person, her name is Kwak Palan, an Asian feminist theologian, hit the nail on the head when she said, a theology of justice involves a desire to disengage from empire, to disrupt and reorientate colonizing discourse towards a more life-giving discourse. It recognizes, she said, that the world is not what it should be and begins to construct a new way of interpreting both the past, the present, and the future. Now, I started this presentation by referencing the most respected of Baptist theologians, Dr. King. Let me finish with him. If King were alive today and he lived in the UK, he would be calling on and mobilizing Black and brown and white Christians to employ both external and internal tools to resist the system responsible for this thoroughly racist legislation. Mindful that King was a pastor, a prophet, and a theologian, his prophetic resistance will be deeply rooted in the activities and actions that reflect and embody the God of the Exodus, the God who privileges the poor and the marginalized. So how should Black and brown Christians in particular respond to this draconian bill? Through prophetic action, through resistance, and thirdly, ensuring that the prophetic resistance is motivated and inspired by a Black and brown Jesus who privileges the racialized.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much, Wale, for that theological exploration of why, as Black and brown Christians, we must have a prophetic resistance. We'd like to thank all of our panelists for their insight and their input. And we are now going to move to the second half of our program tonight, where you as the audience will have an opportunity to ask your questions to our panelists about the Nationality and Borders Bill. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, and I see the questions pouring into our question and answer icon. So we'll ensure that we'll read as much as we can, and I will apologize in advance if we don't get to answer all the questions, but the questions will be shown to our panelists. So my first question is to Steve. Steve, you mentioned the power of community organizing. Could you please explain what that is for our audience and how church communities can get involved in this civic movement and build their power and voice?
Wow, what a brilliant question. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, far be it for me, I'm not the expert on community organising, and perhaps the others will want to chip in, but essentially it's about power. I found the question of community organising really challenging when I first started, because theologically, I have a real sort of passion around the incarnation to determine how I operate as a Christian. And for me, incarnation was about God, the all-powerful, giving up his power in order to be born vulnerable like us in the world. And so when somebody sort of said to me, you know, community organizing is this thing that should be embraced by Christians and it's all about elevating our power, I was like, but how does that translate when I live my life by an incarnational theology that says I should be giving up my power in order to serve the vulnerable on the ground? And then I realized that's not at all what the incarnation was all about. There is a determination that we give up our autocratic power, our sort of dominating power. But what Christ did by being incarnated was building community power and building a church and starting with a handful of people that ultimately demonstrated the power of the kingdom of God as we understand it. And so for me, community organizing is fundamentally about working with others, building institutional power and strength, to be able to speak to people who are in power to say, this matters, this is wrong, this is an injustice. And it's not just me saying this, it's me saying this with those that are like me. And perhaps even more importantly, I'm speaking with those that are not like me. And as you demonstrate that sense of power, that can bring about effective change. And we've heard about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement a bit from Wale and from others. Far be it for me to pretend to be the expert on that. But this was something that was embraced in those movements, to say, we need to organize. This is about being strategic and recognizing that a demonstration of real power can bring about effective change. So yes, you know, in terms of the question, how you can do that locally, there are all sorts of institutions like Citizens UK that embrace the theory of community organising to bring about change, not just on a national level, but actually in your local communities. Where are the injustices, and especially the racial injustices that happen in your towns and your townships? Gather together with others, not just churches, but other faith institutions and other civic institutions like universities and things like that. Talk about how you share those frustrations against injustice in common, and then collaboratively you can build an audience with those that are in power, because you can demonstrate this broad base of civic understanding that says this is not okay and you do not speak for us when you stand up for these sort of things.
Mm. Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that, and for that exploration of what community organising is and how churches can get involved in building their voice against abuse of power. I'm going to go down that line again, particularly for Wale and Patrick. You know, you both mentioned about the abuses of power. And the question I have for you is, why is speaking against abuse of power important to Christian witness and also those working in society for social justice?
Well, it's certainly a theological mandate of the Christian church to speak truth to power, and to do that regularly, to do that carefully, and to do that constructively as well. And this is, I mean, speaking truth to power is something that churches have done historically. It does make a huge difference, and I think we've seen some of that difference in terms of the letter that JPIT has circulated. Now, obviously, we can't assess the level of difference that has made thus far, so the extent of difference that has made thus far, but I would imagine it will make incremental differences over time. And as Christians, we have a voice. It's a voice, it's an eloquent and powerful voice that's been given to us by God. And if we're able to utilize that voice collectively within a community context, I think it can make a massive difference to racial injustice and other manifestations of injustice as well.
Thank you, Wale. Patrick?
Yes, I mean, there's been a long history of campaign and activism. I mean, and if you look at the role of churches, they've always been involved in that. I mean, if you look at the early developments of the Pentecostal church movement, that was active defiance when, you know, Black parishioners were rejected in mainstream churches and they had to create their own churches. So we've had a long history of that. I mean, if you look at the history of race relations bills and acts from 1965 up to modern day, that has been one of the struggle. Power is never given to the communities. We've always had to get power. And it's always been around mobilization. Sadly, those mobilizations happen around when people have died or murdered, a massive tragedy of injustice. Just look what happened with Stephen Lawrence and his murder. Look what happened with the Windsor scandal. I mean, go back to Kelso Cochrane in the 1950s. There've been loads of examples where people and Christians have been involved, and other faiths have been involved. And it's interesting, how do you balance that prophetic perspective around survival and fighting for people's rights? I mean, last week Sunday, a week on Sunday, I worked with a number of Black women, and we organised a vigil and a demonstration for Child Q in Hackney. Must have been about 2,000 to 3,000 people there, and there were a number of church leaders there that came. And since then, I mean, there've been various letters written by a whole range of church leaders showing their anguish and indignation how this young girl was treated by the school and by the police. And, you know, I just wish there could be more activism in the church. You know, I know that at times, I mean, even during the Windsor scandal, I remember there were some Black Christians actually saying, "Oh, it's got nothing to do with me." Of course, it has everything to do with you, because, you know, because lots of the people in the churches were affected by the Windsor scandal. You know, so I think, you know, there's times when you have to put your head above the parapet. I remember when I used to go to church as a teenager, and, you know, there were lots of things happening in the Black community. We'll stop and search. All things were happening in the community. A lot of people were in section of the Mental Health Act, but the churches at that time had a blind approach to that. They said, "Well, it's got nothing to do with us. We're looking for the afterlife." But now I think more and more churches are doing more working, and I've worked closely with a number of church leaders over the last 10, 15 years on a whole range of issues and campaigns. But we need to have more of that. I think it's important that if you see an injustice, you need to call it out. So this immigration bill is an injustice. It needs to be called out, along with other things in the community. And I think it's important that it's not about being reactive at times. Sometimes you have to be there and proactive, and to reach out to those in the community to be involved in that. I mean, for example, even in the Caribbean, there's lots of church leaders involved in the whole reparations support around the movement of that, working alongside Rastafarians. I think this is brilliant. I think we should be doing more of that kind of stuff as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wale and Richard, for that. We have a question from the Zoom floor. And this question is directed to Alicia from the Evangelical Alliance. And the question is, can the bill be defeated?
$1 million question. So it's about numbers, as with anything. So the Conservative Party have an 80 majority in the House of Commons, which essentially means all backbenchers within the Conservative Party will be encouraged and instructed to support the bill. And so to turn over the bill, particularly in the Commons, to get the votes against specific amendments, there needs to be an overturn of 80, which is a huge numbers game, which is why I set the context of 2019 and very much in the manifesto of the Conservative Party back then, that they needed a majority in order to get through their legislative program. And so in part, is it possible for the bill to be defeated? Possibly not, particularly on where the government have made hard lines. hard lines around the differential treatment of how those seeking asylum access the country and the support that will be given. That's a red line for which the government is not prepared to compromise on, and they've given a response in since last week's vote, explaining why they feel that that's the justified, fair, and also I saw another question in the chat that is in line with the United Nations Convention on Refugees. So in many ways, there is a role of the House of Lords to continue to advocate. There's a role of the community and faith groups and individuals that care about this bill to be engaging your local member of parliament, writing, sharing that you're concerned. We each occupy different spaces and different constituencies, particularly those who are Conservative MPs if you live in that area. So in terms of the bill, can it be defeated? Highly unlikely, and that's just a truth that I just want to share. I don't want to gloss over that. It's about the numbers. And as I said, there's hard lines for which the government had placed that they're not prepared to concede at this point. And also, as the bill was going through conversation, even representatives from the United Nations spoke out against the government's direction of travel on this bill.
Thank you, Alicia, for that clarity. Thank you. We have a question from Rod McCory, who says, is there broad agreement in the wider ecumenical church in opposition to this bill? And are you working with overseas mission agencies with expertise on refugees? So I'll open that up to the panel to answer. Either Wale or Steve.
Well, I think my understanding is that there is certainly wide opposition to the bill. I mean, I can't speak authoritatively with regards, obviously, all the various denominations in the UK, but certainly the denominations that I have relationships with, I think all of them are appalled by the bill. And certainly all of them, to my knowledge, would agree that this is a thoroughly comprehensive, racist piece of legislation, and many of them too are writing against this bill and are using creative ways, both external and internal, to challenge the bill as well. So generally speaking, I think a lot of people are finding ways to actually repudiate the immigration bill.
Yeah, I would echo that, and certainly if you, I mean, you can see the list of all the people that signed the letter that we wrote, and there are key leaders in the vast majority of Christian denominations in the UK. Many Catholic bishops and Church of England bishops have signed it. Church of England, it's tricky because they have a role within Parliament. You know, there are bishops in the House of Lords, and so it is quite difficult for them to juggle where they sign these public statements and where they use their influence within power. And I think that's an ongoing conversation for us all to consider, that there are moments where you need to be that prophetic voice from outside of power saying, this is shameful, this is wrong, this is against the will of God. And then there are those for whom have an influence within power and have to use their voice in a slightly different way. And I'm not going to judge them for making those decisions. You know, these are the Daniels inside Babylon that are using their influence to bring change from within. And so there were some bishops who didn't sign the letter, but intentionally, because they're using that inside power. And actually, if you watch the speech from the Bishop of Durham, he made it very explicit that had it not been for their power within, they would have backed our letter. So I think it is fair to say that those across various denominations are together against this bill, and not least because Churches Together groups have also made their own statements against this and are working collaboratively to find out how they can lobby. In terms of whether we work with overseas mission agencies with expertise on refugees, it's tricky because the truth is when you're campaigning in UK law, you have to consider what the UK government's self-interest is in this. And the voices of overseas groups do not always speak most clearly to the UK government's self-interest. And I think this comes back a little bit to what Alicia was saying about whether it's winnable or not. You have to think about what the self-interest is in the government here. They want to be re-elected, and while they believe that this is what the UK public wants, that is what they will continue to push. And so in the short term, I think Alicia's analysis of this is correct, that it is going to be extremely difficult to persuade the UK government that they need to completely change their mind on this, but it is a long game as well. And there are short, small wins that can be won, where we demonstrate, for instance, that, you know, the Ukrainian policy of the government at the moment is that child refugees from Ukraine can come and be relocated to be rejoined with their family here in the UK if they're uncles, aunts, grandparents, adult siblings. But if you're not Ukrainian, that is not an open door for you. Now, it is for people like you and I to say, at best, that is inconsistent. At worst, it is explicitly racist. That some refugees are able to reunite with their family and others aren't. And actually, there's a huge voice across the country at the moment that is really proud of what we're doing for the Ukrainians. But it is our job to say, we are not here advocating just for Ukrainian refugees. That is brilliant what the government are doing for them, but they should be doing it for all. And the British public believe that. And if we're going to transform and change the minds of the government, we need to express that to our local MPs. That's the only way we can bring that about.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve, for that. And, you know, you actually answered Richard Martin's question, which was about, do you see an openness of Britain to Ukrainian refugees as a positive sign that the basis for this bill might already be subverted? Or would the government's response have been different, do you think, if Ukrainians were a predominantly non-white community? And I think you've addressed that in your response. So Richard, I hope that answers your question. Right, so going back to the Zoom floor, Alicia, you mentioned about the red lines within the government bill and the unlikelihood of defeating it due to the numbers. However, could you give some clarity around what amendments are to bills, and also clause 9? Is there any room for amendment there?
Hi, I'm actually going to read specifically the wording around the government's proposed word changes to clause 9, which is so subtle and so small that it doesn't change the overall direction. So I just want to read word for word what was proposed. So the Commons rejected Lords' amendment to remove clause 9. That was the direction of travel from the Lords. They wasn't dealing with slight word changes. They were like, the entire clause needs to be removed. And instead, it was proposed that this new wording would take its place. The Secretary of State reasonably consider it necessary in the interests of national security, the investigation or prosecution of organised or serious crime, preventing or reducing a risk to the safety of any person or the relationship between the United Kingdom and another country, that the notice under that subsection should not be given. So in layman's terms, what the government are proposing is very much the same thing, that clause 9 would remain, but it is the ability to deprive an individual of citizenship is under these 4 criteria. One, it pertains to national security. The other, that there's an incident of organised crime, that it would reduce or prevent safety of any person, and that it's linked with kind of international affairs between the United Kingdom and another country. And then it goes on and lists another 2 pages of specific wording. And that's where we're at with the bill. Every word matters, every word counts, but the overall change to clause 9 in that the Home Secretary has the power to remove citizenship without notice still remains a prominent feature of this bill. And that's what the House of Lords are going to have to consider on Monday the 4th when it goes back for discussion and deliberation. Do they accept that phrasing, that wording? Because every word, every line will be scrutinized. And so it'd be interesting to see how the Lords respond, how they react, and how they engage with this, whether they'll continue to push back. And there's this language between Parliament of ping pong, which is essentially what's happening. The bill is going from one house to the other, back and forth on every wording and every amendment proposal to seek the votes of that. So the next stage is just to see how the House of Lords engage. But the overall principle is still concerning in that it still gives power to the Home Secretary of the day to remove citizenship. And I guess just to give a slight commentary on that, it also shows the distrust between the British public because of the failings of successive governments, not just the Conservative government, Conservative and Lib Dem, the Labour Party, on immigration issues pertaining to nationality and the Windrush scandal, that people don't trust the good intention that this clause will only be specific to foreign nationals engaged in terrorism acts. They feel it will be a carte blanche to remove citizenship more generally.
Thank you, Alicia, for that. I'm actually going to come back to you before going after, and we'll go to Patrick after you. We've had a question from Eric McArthur, who's asked, if this bill becomes law, would a future government be able to overturn it?
I mean, the answer is yes, it could. But only if they're in power, only if they can do, and I suppose that is, you know, for us, that is the fundamental question, that the reason why the government can do as much as they can is because of this massive majority that Alicia spoke about earlier. If there was a wafer-thin majority, then the power of us as local people who can lobby out local MPs increases exponentially, because that smaller majority or you know, losing to a party that would perhaps take a different stance means that this negotiation is a lot more fragile. And so yes, it can. Some of that would involve persuading other parties to include more compassionate immigration policies in their manifestos when they are standing for election at the next general election, because a lot of what finds its ground is other things that they're explicit about in the way that they campaign. And so, you know, it's reminded me that we can campaign on specific issues until the cows come home, but the biggest campaign that there is the general election, and to press your local candidates to find out how they feel about this and what their parties believe is critically important for those moments. I'm not trying to be party political here. You know, the truth is, if you look at all those that voted for these amendments and those that voted against, there is pretty explicit party lines around it. But the truth is, when parties gain power, it doesn't take long for them to start to claw back on some of the things that they've said in the past. So to try to encourage them to be as explicit as possible in their manifestos is really important.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. So I'm going to come to Patrick now. There's two questions that we have for you from the Zoom floor. The first is from Derek Morgan, who asks, how is the Windrush compensation scheme working and how many people have been paid? And the other question is, are there synergies between the Nationality and Borders Bill and the proposed Crime and Policing Bill?
Okay, let me deal with the latter one first. So, as I mentioned before, both bills have basically want to try and suppress opposition. So the crime bill is about restricting our rights to express ourselves in a democracy around demonstrations. And they've even taken it a stage further, that if you were to remove or deface a statue, and usually it'll be a statue connected with a slave trader, you could be sentenced up to 10 years, which is absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. And obviously that's in response to what happened in Bristol with the removal of Colston statue, basically. So the crime bill is just more powers for the police around stop and search. And as you know, what's happened, particularly in the Met Police in London, I know a bit more about that being in London, that there's over the last several years, there've been lots of scandals with the Met Police, the way they've treated the whole situation around Sarah Everard, of that rogue police officer, you know, Charles Q, and the misogyny and canteen culture is actually getting worse. There's actually a decline in the number of black and brown people wanting to be part of the police force. There is a toxic culture of policing in Britain. During the height of the lockdown, there were 22,000 stop and searches, even though most of us were at home. How that all happen? So, you know, so the crime bill is linked, giving more powers to the police, which is also linked to the Borders Bill, because it'll give more powers to the Home Office, who will then give those powers to the police, and also it'll be more powers to private security firms who are involved in deporting people, and those charter books, which are done by private companies. And it feels like it's a money-making exercise, the amount of money that is spent on that, basically. And it will create more fear. Both of these legislations will create more fear. We'll be more fearful of ourselves and create a degree of uncertainty about our rights in this country. And if you add in them getting rid of the human rights aspect as well, and not taking seriously equality legislation, we're in a very precarious situation regarding our rights as citizens in this country. And in terms of the Windrush scandal, or Windrush compensation scheme, was launched 3 years ago. And to date, the Home Office have offered roughly about £40 million, but actually less than 1,000 people have accepted the compensation. There's a backlog of a few thousand people that have appealed against the derisory amounts of money that's been offered by the Home Office. They've not looked properly, they've not had a holistic approach. They're demanding the same level of paperwork, and that's actually re-traumatized a lot of the survivors of the Windrush scandal in terms of the compensation. That's why number one, there's a lot of people who haven't come forward yet to make their claims, because technically speaking, just under 15,000, just under about 14,000 have had their status regularised through the Windrush Task Force, which means that everyone automatically are entitled to compensation. There are actually a number of cases where they've actually rejected people's compensation claims because they haven't got proof. If you've lost your job and they want you to go to your former employer to get letters to prove that you lost your job because of your immigration status, and they want proof that you tried to mitigate your circumstances by applying for jobs. How can you apply for jobs when you haven't got status in the first place? It's like a vicious circle, and it's so dispiriting for a lot of the survivors. Over 25 people have died while waiting for compensation. It's outrageous, and it raises issues again. Why are they treating the Windrush generation in this appalling way when the government apologises every single week? They know that they have to sort this out. I've been part of a campaign for the last nearly 3 years for the compensation scheme to be removed from the Home Office and to be managed by independent armed length agency. You know, the community does not trust the Home Office. Would you trust the Home Office? You know, and you know, but the government is so insistent of managing the scheme. So there's two conclusions you can come to. Either they don't really want to pay out this money at all, or give the least amount of money as possible, or they're just waiting for people to die. If you speak to any Windrush survivor, they believe that they're waiting for people to die rather than give the money out. I mean, unfortunately, there haven't been, apart from myself and some lawyers and a number of Windrush victims who've been campaigning, there's not been that much public support to put pressure on the government. I mean, I've done various petitions, which have had lots of signatures, like just about 130,000 signatures. I would urge you, this network and members of this network to contact your local MP to say, what are you doing for the wilderness generation? Can you put pressure on them? We should be mobilising to make sure that these men and women get their compensation. They're all suffering in silence again. They're all traumatised. They're all suffering from post-traumatic stress. And some of them are now having long-term health conditions because the stress has had a big impact on their physiology. So it's still ongoing. And the compensation scheme needs to be managed independently, and also the wilderness victims need to be given proper respect and care and treatment. The way that the scheme is designed, they're treating like benefits grounders. If you see the letters that is written from the Home Office when they're making those offers, they're almost like doing you a favour to give you money. It's complete opposite, unchristian-like, unethical-like. This has to change because there's so much sorrow still. I mean, I could just go on about this, to be quite honest. It's just outrageous. It's just outrageous. Why is it that Black people are meant to be suffering like this? This is a fundamental question I keep on saying to myself. Why are we meant to be suffering on this way? When the injustice has been exposed, yet we are still being suffering in this way. So we need to keep campaigning, we need to put pressure. Please write to your MP and put pressure on the government to make sure that the scheme is removed from the Home Office. The government uses, the main reason why the government said they want to hold on to the scheme is data protection, which is rubbish. They lose the data all the time. They have contracts with third sector organisations and private sector companies around data share around particular services. So that is red herring. And the second reason what they say is that it'll take much longer if it goes to agency. With all due respect, 25 people have died waiting for compensation. And a lot of people have no faith in the Home Office. They'd rather wait for a new agency, a new body, decent caseworkers who are empathetic to support their cases. That's why the scheme needs to be removed.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for giving us that overview of the distrust that is in communities. Thank you for that. Now, before we start to come down, and I know I'm in a room full of ministers, and when we say come down, it usually means another 20 minutes, but I do promise that we are going to finish on time this evening. We do have a theological question for you, Wale, from the Zoom floor that says, do you think the overwhelming message of forgiveness prevents us seeking justice?
That's a very good question. I think it can prevent us from seeking justice. I think my question is, should it prevent us? And the answer is no, it shouldn't prevent us. I mean, one example is what's going on in the moment in terms of the Caribbean and the strong possibility that Jamaica may become a republic, and some of the kind of sociological factors that have precipitated this conversation, recognizing that it's vast and it's complex and it's got history to it, but nevertheless realizing too that surely one of the factors responsible for their conclusion is the tone of the debate around reparations from the UK, which has been extremely negative. Now, I mean, no doubt that a lot of Caribbean people have kind of, forgiven what has happened in the past in terms of slavery, enslavement, and so it continues. But nevertheless, despite having forgiven, reparations is still being requested. In other words, justice still needs to prevail. So I think it's important to forgive. Clearly that's a biblical mandate. But at the same time, within the context of that forgiveness, it is still very important for the followers of Jesus to seek change, to seek transformation, to seek reparations. I also maintain that on the matter of forgiveness, that forgiveness should lead to repentance, and repentance should lead to transformation. I'm currently reading a book by a guy called Volve. It's called End of Memory, and he kind of engages with the whole matter around reconciliation and forgiveness. And he's a really great thinker, superb theologian. And one of the points that he makes is we do need to forgive. We need to forgive the atrocities of the past. And those who have been oppressed need to do it because of theological reasons, but also because of psychological reasons as well. But at the same time, he argues that we still need to seek justice in the midst of forgiveness. And I think he's absolutely right, absolutely right. The two really do go hand in hand. They are intimately connected.
Thank you so much for that, Wale, and just really emphasizing that sacrificial nature of forgiveness and how forgiveness and justice go hand in hand. Thank you for that. So as we come down, as we start to close the evening, I am now going to ask each panelist for 1 minute just to give you a closing remark and one thing that church leaders and our audience can do. So we'll start with you, Alicia. We'll then go to Steve, Patrick, and then Wale.
1 minute to close. I'm always shaped by a Brian Stevenson quote that talks about, he's a writer of Just Mercy and an attorney in America that does a lot on death row. And he always spoke about his proximity to the issue helped him to be a better lawyer and a better advocate. And I feel on the subject of migration, immigration, asylum and refugee resettlement, our proximity as people of faith across the country, even across the political spectrum. I dare not assume everyone is of one political persuasion in this conversation. Our proximity needs to get closer. So there needs to be a better understanding of the impact of immigration in your local community. There's an opportunity to connect with other member organizations or faith-based communities that specialize in this space. If you're a church leader, maybe there's an opportunity for you to be thinking about financial funds to support those who are either seeking asylum or going through the immigration process at the moment, because it's an expensive thing. And advocacy, I think as people of faith, we often confine our faith to the private space or a Sunday service or throughout, but definitely there needs to be a maturity that our faith affects our politics and our mission engagement. So do consider engaging either with us at the Evangelical Alliance or JPIT or any other organization in this space of specific call to actions in the coming week.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to reiterate my appreciation of being invited into this space, especially as a white middle-class guy in Essex. I can't thank you enough for that grace. I mean, so much has been said today about the hope of what we can hope for. You know, I want to reiterate, I do think this bill is going to pass. And that can leave us quite dejected. And especially for those of us that have campaigned fairly tirelessly on this for a long time. But we believe in a God of miracles, and we believe in a God of justice. And we as Christians, it is our calling and our mandate to work for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. And so despite that sense of frustration and disappointment, don't give up. Don't give up. Find some small way that you can make a difference in your local community, to your MP. As somebody mentioned earlier, we've got council elections coming up. There is a long game at play here. And I believe the trajectory of the world is towards the kingdom of God. And so be a part of that. And, you know, in the chat, I've just posted the link to our latest thing on the Nationality and Borders Bill from JPIT. It's got a link to a template letter that you can use when you're writing to your MP. Please adapt it, include clause 9 on it. We haven't been able to because it's not been part of our campaign, but please just adapt it to reflect your own heart and your own feelings on it. But get involved in whatever way, shape or form you can. There's a conference coming up in June for JPIT. You can find that on the website as well, where the CEO of Migration Action is going to come and share some stuff around that too. Yeah, just don't give up hope, please. Just keep fighting for the kingdom of God.
Thank you, Steve. And now very quickly, literally 1 minute each, because we do want to respect people's time. So Patrick and then Wale.
I think I've already said about you can still do stuff, and I think that's the message we're all saying. Despite all the doom and gloom out there, we can still do stuff. It still stops me. I'm still campaigning and fighting a whole range of issues. So my advice to you, if you're not a campaigner now, you've got no choice. You are. So welcome.
Thank you.
During the course of the conversation, I was putting down some names of Black activists, of which I think they all share a number of things in common, but there's one particular thing that they share in common, and that is creative anger. So people like Zadie Smith, Diane Abbott, Baroness Amos, Afua Hirsch, Dr. Shola, Mavis Best, Patrick Vernon, Sam King, Gus John, James Cone, Malcolm X, Luther King, Howard Thurman, Pauline Murray, William Barber, and there are many, many others. They were all activists, some of them still are activists. And that thing that keeps them going, I think that gets them up in the morning, that underpins their conviction, is a sense of this must stop, this must stop, this must stop. That creative anger propels them into action and to engage in activity and good works, and thus contribute towards God's coming kingdom.
Thank you so much. And as we close, we do want to just remind our audience of Isaiah 43:16-21, which speaks prophetically to social injustice and a whole nation that has been culturally colonized. And the prophet reminds them, you know, look what God did for you in the Exodus. He took you out, parted the Red Sea, but forget the former things and look forward. So press on in hope as we continue to look at this issue in our different contexts. So we would like to thank our panel of distinguished guests for their contributions this evening and for helping us to navigate the Nationality and Borders Bill. It's a complex issue and we thank you for your time. We would also like to thank you, all of our audience, for attending on this evening. You can go and have some dinner now. And we hope that this webinar has provided you insight and, most importantly, some actions for how you can support your congregation and communities that will be potentially impacted by this bill. Have a good evening and God bless you. Take care.